Welcome back. All right, so power rankings. Yes, it is the off season, but I'm going to do a power rankings of Stanley Cup champions from 1995 until 2025. The last time I did this, it was 1989 till 2019. I know I did not figure this out the same way that I did last time. I've spent 2 days coming out with this list, and this is probably as good as it's going to get. And there were some that I was surprised by how low they were, some I was surprised by how high they were. And so I look forward to people in the comments telling me I clearly hate their favorite team because, or well, this team's higher up because, and various, because I just used math. There's just math, and the only subjectivity may be a couple of different parts of the team, but in general, it's math I utilized for this. So that being said, preamble aside, number 30 on the board, the LA Kings from 2014. The 2014 LA Kings, good Stanley Cup champion, absolutely. And seeing them at 30 honestly kind of surprised me a little bit. I had figured they'd be higher than that. But with the math I was using, the math put the LA Kings at 30th on the board. I had actually thought about whether or not I should intervene and move some teams around, but I thought, no, we're going to just leave it at the math. I've already had a little bit of subjectivity in this. So, number 29, the Carolina Hurricanes from, of course, 2006. Carolina's won the one Stanley Cup. Of course, the Kings have won two, and 2014 was the Kings' second Stanley Cup win. 2006 to date, the only Stanley Cup win for the Carolina Hurricanes. And it was a good story. It was a bit of an underdog story for the Carolina Hurricanes, who had a good regular season, weren't taken that seriously going into those playoffs, and made people regret that they weren't taken as seriously in those playoffs as they should have been. Of course, Cam Ward was quite the story there. The one thing with the 2014 Kings was that, unlike 2012, they didn't seem to rely on Jonathan Quick as much. This was a team in 2014 that got back to the Stanley Cup and won it for the second time in 3 years. And did it in a very different fashion than the previous time out. Number 28 on the board. Yeah, Tampa. I've used the mascot magnet. So this is the 2004 Stanley Cup champion Tampa Bay Lightning, which of course there was no controversy in that Stanley Cup final against Calgary at all. But the Tampa Bay Lightning team, good team. And it was fun to watch them go through and win that Stanley Cup in 2004. I always enjoy seeing that first Stanley Cup for a franchise. There's a certain level of joy that seems to be there when guys get their first Stanley Cup. When a franchise gets their first Stanley Cup, it's pretty universal. So the Tampa Bay Lightning were a very good regular season team in 03-04, end up winning the Stanley Cup that season. Number 27 on the board. This would surprise me a little bit that they weren't higher, but hey. The Pittsburgh Penguins of 2017. This, of course, is the second of back-to-back Stanley Cups. The Pittsburgh Penguins, 3 Stanley Cups on this board. If I went all the way back to 91, of course, they'd have 5 Stanley Cups on the board, but I don't think they'd fit on this board. And what a nightmare to go back that far. I'm not saying that there won't be a point where I actually do. I've talked about doing a power ranking of every Stanley Cup champion ever, which you might have to, make sure you've got a coffee and you've had a meal, because that could end up being quite a lengthy video. But the Pittsburgh Penguins, 2017, back-to-back Stanley Cup champions. And to me, this just shows how many good Stanley Cup champions there are when a back-to-back winner ends up at number 27. At number 26, the only Stanley Cup win for the St. Louis Blues to date. That, of course, being from 2019. The St. Louis Blues, not much was thought of them halfway through that season. They made a change behind the bench, which did work out pretty darn well for them. And so the St. Louis Blues do win that Stanley Cup. 6 years ago now they won that Stanley Cup. And this is why you enjoy that Stanley Cup when it gets there. This is why I'm enjoying the Calder Cup. You can see it peeking out over the clock there. That is the Abbotsford Canucks Calder Cup too. That's not the other one. That's the brand new one. So yeah, the Blues in 2019... That's a memory for Blues fans. Nobody can take away from them. And then in 25th spot, New Jersey Devils. So the Devils, that is the 2003 New Jersey Devils that I have ranked at 25th. So that is their third and most recent Stanley Cup victory. The New Jersey Devils, of course, looking to get back to that kind of glory at some point soon. But that rounds out the bottom row. So New Jersey, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Tampa, Carolina, LA, all. And this is the thing that if you want to point a finger at a Stanley Cup champion and go, well, they wouldn't have won in that year. They wouldn't have won. Well, yeah, but they won in the year they did. So they were still better than at least 29 other teams. And, of course, right now you're better than 31 other teams. No, that was not a factor in terms of how I graded things because you still have 16 teams in the playoffs. So, up to 24th, and the Pittsburgh Penguins are on the board again. This time it is the 2009 Penguins. So that'll be the first Stanley Cup victory for Sidney Crosby and the team. The first Stanley Cup victory for the Pittsburgh Penguins since 1992. And a pretty strong victory as well. And so I was kind of surprised they weren't higher up. But I'm not going to question the math on this. 24th is where the Pittsburgh Penguins find themselves on this list. Number 23. Going back to 2011 for this one. And that, of course, being the Boston Bruins. It is the only Boston Bruins Stanley Cup on this board. For me to have Boston on here again, I'd have to go back to 1972. The board won't go back that far unless I'm using really tiny magnets. And I already get told that people can't read my boards as it is. So, not really looking forward to going that far back at this point in time. But yeah, the Boston Bruins in 2011, they had quite the run. They did get forced to 7 games in 3 of the 4 series. Means that it was a tense environment in those Stanley Cup playoffs. But Boston ends up 23rd on this power ranking of Stanley Cup champions. Number 22. Pittsburgh's on the board again. This is 2016. And that means that 22, that is the highest ranking Pittsburgh Penguins team. But the fact they have 3 Stanley Cups means that when I do a video, and I will, I'm going to do a power ranking of teams since the inception of the salary cap in 05-06. Pittsburgh's going to be really high on that board. So for Penguin fans, fear not. When I get through and I do a power rankings of 05-06 through until now, Pittsburgh's going to be right at or near the top via the 3 Stanley Cup victories they have, because I give the same amount of points for Stanley Cup wins no matter what year and no matter how they get it. Stanley Cup win's a Stanley Cup win. So 2016 Pittsburgh Penguins end up 22nd on the board. So we move along to 21st. And 21st is the only Washington Capitals Stanley Cup to date anyways. That being 2018. So the Penguins in 2016, Penguins in 2017, Capitals in 2018. This is where the Metro Division was pretty darn tough to beat. And the Washington Capitals, of course, were coming off winning the President's Trophy in 2016 and 2017, and then won the Stanley Cup in 2018. Number 20 on the board, 1996, the Colorado Avalanche. Their first year in Colorado. And the Avalanche win the Stanley Cup, which made Nordiques fans feel really, really good for them. I mean, it was tough. It was tough for me as a hockey fan because I had rooted for the Nordiques. I had watched them go through these really bad seasons. They were finally a good team. They were starting to sell out again. And then the team got moved because various reasons. But the year after they moved, they won the Stanley Cup. And yes, Montreal would not have traded Patrick Roy to the Quebec Nordiques, but doesn't mean the Nordiques wouldn't have figured out a way to win the Stanley Cup in 1996 as it was. But the Avalanche win it, and they're number 20 on the board. Number 19, going back to 2000 for this one, the New Jersey Devils. So the second time the New Jersey Devils are on the board, and this being the 2000 Stanley Cup. So that one ends up being ranked ahead of the 2003 Stanley Cup. 2000 is where Larry Robinson wins it as an interim coach. It's listed right on the Stanley Cup, at least on the entry I found. It looks like he was still listed as the interim coach at the time that they won the Stanley Cup. I don't think that's what's engraved on the cup. I would be very surprised if it says interim on the Stanley Cup. Probably just says head coach Larry Robinson. But it was quite the run for the New Jersey Devils. And I remember thinking they're crazy to change their coach. And then they won the Stanley Cup. So it wasn't crazy after all. Number 18. Going back to 2015 for this one. And it's the Chicago Blackhawks. And I did try to get creative when it came to which magnets I used for this video. If I'm not going to use the puck board, I'm going to get creative with which magnets that I use. And the puck board, I think, is better suited just being left for the regular season and for all that. But the Chicago Blackhawks in 2015, that is their third Stanley Cup in 6 seasons. And there was a little bit of controversy with that. There's controversy with almost every Stanley Cup winner on the board, let's be honest. LTIR is going to be mentioned with a few of them. We haven't got any LTIR ones on the board yet, do we? No, not yet. So, yeah, the Chicago Blackhawks in 2015. I'm going to say this, though. To date, that is one of the best Stanley Cup finals I've watched, was Chicago-Tampa. That was a very, very good Stanley Cup final. Really can't take anything away from that. Even though I was rooting for Tampa in that final, when Chicago won, I begrudgingly had to respect that this team had done it yet again. And that series against Tampa was just, if you want to watch a Stanley Cup final that went really, really well, that Stanley Cup final was it. Which brings us up to number 17, and it's Tampa. So we're almost to the halfway mark. This is the 2021 Stanley Cup champion, Tampa Bay Lightning. So it's a back-to-back champion, same as Pittsburgh was. The Tampa Bay Lightning, honestly, a wagon at that point in time. Vasilevsky at his best again. And top to bottom, a very good team in Tampa. That, of course, being the most recent Stanley Cup for the Tampa Bay Lightning. And then we have that whole debate about whether or not they're going to win another one. And I mention that here because I still think they could. But there are a number of teams that could win a Stanley Cup this coming season. I do like, even if there's not actually parity, I like the appearance of parity. We've talked about how there's no parity. There may be a video at some point this summer on whether or not there is really true parity in the NHL. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to measure that, but I'd look back over the last probably 5 or 6 seasons, and Tampa would be highly rated over that period in time. So moving from this row into the top 2 rows, so now we're into the top 16, and at 16, it is the 2024 Stanley Cup champion, Florida Panthers. The Florida Panthers were not expected to win the Stanley Cup in 2024. More expected in 2025 because of 2024. The interesting thing is they went all the way to the final, of course, in 2023. So, yeah, the Florida Panthers, really strong roster top to bottom, excellent coaching, very well put together team, and they barely get into that second row because there's some very good Stanley Cup champions in here, aren't there? Number 15, 2010 Chicago Blackhawks. The first Stanley Cup victory by the Chicago Blackhawks for a very long time. And the first victory for Quenneville and everybody. And, of course, we're going to have 3 of those on the board. And Chicago now has been in a rebuild for a while. And that's kind of what happens. You go through these periods where you have a lot of success during the regular season and postseason. You're mortgaging your future to do it, which makes some sense. And then you end up in a bit of a rebuild. And if you do the full teardown, which Chicago did, it makes that rebuild last a lot longer. Pittsburgh, who are on the board here, I don't think it's going to be a full teardown. I don't think they're going to do that. Number 14 on the board, it's Chicago again. So the Chicago Blackhawks, 2013. And yeah, this is almost the same magnet as the one I used for 18. This is just a bigger version of that magnet. And so for the Chicago Blackhawks, the 2013 team, the one in the middle is the one that I ranked the highest at 14th on the board. Of course, that's a lockout shortened season. They had a great regular season. They bulldozed through the Stanley Cups for the Stanley Cup playoffs for the most part. And yeah, Chicago had themselves a little bit of what a lot of people call a modern dynasty. And I, again, am a stickler, and I say dynasties 3 and 4 years. And means that Florida, if they win another one over the next 2 years, they would become the first official dynasty in the NHL since 1990, when the Oilers won their 4th in 6 years, or 5th in 7 years. I want to take a Stanley Cup away from Edmonton there. All right, number 13, Dallas, 1999. So to date, the only Stanley Cup win for the Dallas Stars. A little bit of controversy there, sure, I will say that, but strong run by the Dallas Stars. One thing that was said about that run that year was that they avoided Detroit. I remember that being a conversation piece being, hey, they won the Stanley Cup. However, they didn't have to play against Detroit. Right, because Colorado beat Detroit. So since Colorado beat Detroit, Dallas beat Colorado, they kind of beat Detroit. Kind of. But I've said Detroit too many times, haven't I? So Detroit has to be next on the board. And it is the first of a few times that they're on the board in this. A few being 4. 2018. Wow, I gave them Washington Stanley Cup. Look at that. 2008 for Detroit. So the Detroit Red Wings, unexpected that they'd win it in 2008, just a little bit, because there were definitely discussions about whether or not some of these players were going to be able to win. And, the 0-2 team, a lot of those guys were gone. Certain players being on the older side and everything. But in the end, Detroit wins the Stanley Cup in 2008. They proved a lot of people wrong for a long time. And, the Detroit Red Wings in 2008, strong Stanley Cup champion. Which brings us to number 11. I was honestly surprised, but I went through all the math, and the 2025 Florida Panthers end up 11th. They do not quite crack the top 10. So the Florida Panthers, number 11 this year, of course, being the second of back-to-backs. I would not be surprised to see them go on another run in 2026. They've kept everybody together. It does get more difficult. There is a lot of punishment that the body takes over the years, especially when you get to the playoffs. The games are that much more intense. There's that much more hitting. There's that much more shot blocking, and so it does take more of a toll. We'll see if it starts to add up with Florida this year or not. So, 2025 Florida Panthers ended up 11th. I'd kind of expected them to be higher, but the dominance they had in the Stanley Cup final was not something I used as a measurement. There was a Stanley Cup final measurement I used, but it didn't have anything to do with how long you had the lead or anything like that. And it's more of a complete picture. If it was just about dominance in the Stanley Cup final, Florida would be higher than 11th. Number 10 on the board, Detroit's here again, 1998. And again, not using the same magnet twice. Has to be a different style of magnet every time out. So if you're a Detroit fan, you're in for a treat. You guys are up a couple more times. But the 1998 Detroit Red Wings, also a back-to-back Stanley Cup winner. That 1998 Stanley Cup, of course, dedicated to Konstantinov, and rightfully so. And it was an emotional night when Detroit won that Stanley Cup. And it was a fun Stanley Cup final that year too, even though it didn't go for very didn't go for very long. They swept Washington, but I enjoyed that series for what it was. All right, number 9, the last one in this row, is New Jersey, 1995. So one thing that I factored in the last time that I did this was road wins and wins as an underdog. And I did not factor that into this one. If I had, New Jersey would have been in the top row. So New Jersey, 1995, that's their Stanley Cups, 25, 19, and 9. The 1995 run was very impressive. I've talked about the trap, and I've never been a big fan of the trap, but I give full credit to the New Jersey Devils for riding that to the Stanley Cup and winning it. It wasn't the most exciting hockey, no, but they got the victory, and they were pretty dominant throughout. So they barely miss out on that top row. Barely miss out on that top row. So that's your second row. We move into the top row. At number 8, the Jonathan Quicks. The LA Kings in 2012, it was remarkable. It was remarkable how few games they lost, how good they looked, even though they were a number 8 seed going into the Stanley Cup playoffs. And Jonathan Quick had what I would say is still, to this day, I think that's the best run a goaltender's ever had in the playoffs that I've watched. And I am including Tim Thomas. Thomas had a great run in 2011, but that 2012 run by Quick, I still think is the best one I've seen. There were just no flaws in his game. He didn't have down games. He was absolutely ridiculous. So while the 2014 Kings are down here, the 2012 Kings are in that top row. Number 7, one of the more recent Stanley Cup winners. There's Vegas. So Vegas, I used the chance magnet for this because why not? 2023 Vegas Golden Knights. There's going to be arguments and debates over LTIR. It does not factor in for me at all. I'm not going to penalize the team for that. And people will say the NHL should have, and fair to make that statement. But for me, the Vegas Golden Knights in 2023, that was a really strong run by them. And, that Stanley Cup final, they looked pretty darn good against a Florida team that has now been taking it out on the rest of the NHL for the last 2 years after losing to the Vegas Golden Knights. Number 6 on the board, Colorado. So I'll bring this one forward. So that's the Colorado Avalanche. That's the Stanley Cup champion one from 2022. So I'll just write 2022 here. So for the people who fast forward to the end and just, to complain, that is the Colorado Avalanche 2022. That's what it is. You fast forward to the end and say, this is stupid. This is dumb. This is stupid. All right, cool. Thanks for fast forwarding to the end. But yeah, the Colorado Avalanche in 2022 end up 6th on the board here, which brings us to number 5, and it's Colorado again. So very little difference between these two Stanley Cup runs in terms of the math here. But the 2001 Stanley Cup win by the Avalanche ends up being first amongst their 3. So 96 since 2022 is 6th, and 2001 is 5th. That Colorado team, just go look at their roster. That roster was stacked. That was something I took more into consideration this time than the last time I did this, which was 5 years ago. I just, how stacked those rosters were. And so, yeah, the top 5 teams are teams that have really stacked rosters. Which brings us to number 4. And it was a stacked roster in 2020. Now, people put down the 2020 playoffs. And I kind of get it. But those bubble playoffs, that was not easy. That was not an easy situation to be playing in. And I was really impressed with Colorado. By Tampa, got a couple Colorados on the board, got Colorado in the brain. But I was impressed by Tampa in the 2020 playoffs in that they never lost their focus, and there would have been excuses for them losing if they had, but they overcame everything. So this was a Tampa team that was bound and determined throughout those bubble playoffs, and they were bound and determined coming out of 2019, which is a big part of that narrative. I think if we'd had a regular playoffs in 2020, if we didn't have a pause, I still think Tampa wins that because they weren't being denied after 2019. Vasilevsky wasn't being denied. Had an incredible run, and I really think that 2020 Stanley Cup, to this day, I think it was born off the awards show in 2019 that made all kinds of jokes about Tampa losing in the first round against Columbus. Vasilevsky didn't laugh, didn't smile, nothing. He was choked. And so coming out of that, I felt like this could be interesting for Tampa, and it was. They managed to get their way to a Stanley Cup in 2020, and I thought it was impressive. I did. Number 3 on the board, from 2007, the Anaheim Ducks. And I changed the magnet I was going to use for this a couple of times. I decided to go with the gold triangle behind the Mighty Ducks logo. But yeah, the Anaheim Ducks, that was a great run. Niedermeyer, Pronger and Niedermeyer. I got Niederreiter stuck in my head, couldn't get it out of there. But Niedermeyer and Pronger and then Jaguar, and just everything went their way. And that was 4 years after the Mighty Ducks had gone to the Stanley Cup final as a surprise. A lot less of a surprise in 2007. And they got the job done in 2007. It was impressive to watch. And so I'm not entirely surprised that Anaheim ends up 3rd on the list. In fact, before doing this video today, I looked up some other lists people have done ranking Stanley Cup champions. Anaheim ranks pretty high on every list. All right, number 2. The Detroit Red Wings from 1997. So this was the Stanley Cup, I think their first Stanley Cup victory since 55. I want to say 55. Somewhere in that area. But when they won that Stanley Cup, it ended the Detroit Dead Things jokes, which have started a comeback. That was the name of the team for a lot of fans who were not Detroit fans until that win in 97. This was a team that we kind of started thinking, have they missed their window? Are they spending a lot of money needlessly? Are some of these contracts coming back to haunt them? Nope. They won the Stanley Cup in 97. Of course, they win it again in 98. Here's the 2008. There's one that's missing. I think it's the one that's first place on this one. And so, yeah, I picked the octopus magnet because why not? and this would be 2002. The 2002 Detroit Red Wings, an absolutely stacked lineup, and a team that showed they weren't done. Because 2002, there was a lot of maybe they're too old, maybe they don't have the right mix in the locker room, and then they were fine. It was 4 years between 98 and 2002, but the 2002 team was maybe the most determined I had seen them. And so Detroit has 4 in the top 12. When the Red Wings have had it put together, they've been pretty darn good. So if you're a Wings fan, the one thing I would say is the guy who was part of these Stanley Cup winners is now your general manager. That should go well. I wore the Spider-Man jersey because I figured why not. With great power comes great responsibility, and in power rankings is great power or something. So I figured, sure, why not? But yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, as I know people will. And if you did your own power rankings, I'm sure your math would come out very much different. But that's kind of the fun thing, is that if I do this again 5 years from now or 2 years from now or whenever, odds are it may end up being different. I may use different numbers to measure out who I think the most dominant Stanley Cup champion was. But for me, it goes from Detroit down to LA, but all of them Stanley Cup champions, and all of them tremendous respect from me along the way. So let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe in the event you may not have done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.